Hey, thanks for watching. This is our 5th video on the book of Job and kind of ending our series on the book of Job. I hope it's been a beneficial study. This is hopefully going to sum up a lot of our thoughts and leave us with a definitive answer. Remember that I said it that way, a definitive answer. This is where the frustration with the book of Job comes in a lot, because we get an answer from God we didn't want. But I think it does give us a deeper look into who God is and give us a greater appreciation for the sovereignty of God in our lives. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's go through the last several chapters here in the book of Job, and then we can kind of summarize our thoughts there at the end. So in chapter 38, Yahweh has come on the scene. If you remember from our last video, Elihu, Job's fourth, I don't know if you can even really call him a friend. He was a younger guy that was looking on, decides to speak up, speak his mind, and now Yahweh has come in. So we no longer have to hear from Job. We no longer have to hear from Job's friends and the inaccuracies that they bring us of God's mind and their presumptions about how God works. Instead, we hear from the mouth of God. How does God view this situation of suffering with a righteous person like Job? If you'll remember some of the things that we've talked about, specifically the RP, the retributive principle that Job's friends believed in, and even Job himself believed in, which means that God prospers the righteous and God brings suffering on the wicked. This is what Job's friends were constantly talking and preaching about to Job. Job thought he believed in that, but now he's not so sure because he lived a righteous life, yet he is suffering. So while Job's friends are adhering to this policy of God, Job is questioning God altogether, because if he has broken this policy of doing good to the righteous, then God is not a good God. So Job puts out some serious accusations in the last several chapters that we read, where Job will associate Yahweh with terror and night and all of these evil chaos creatures. And he says that God must be one of those because Job is suffering the way that he is. So a lot of big things came out in the previous chapters. But finally, we have Yahweh speaking, and we can finally hear the truth that Yahweh gives us when it comes to suffering. One thing that should be pointed out, and I think it's really interesting, is that up to this point, Yahweh has normally been referred to as El Shaddai or as Elohim. Both are Hebrew words, and there's nothing wrong with those words. Elohim is a very general word for God. El Shaddai is a little more specific. It is used elsewhere in the Old Testament, but it can also have a non-Israelite term for a God. So it's not necessarily just a Jewish word being used like Yahweh reveals himself in the book of Exodus. So both terms are a little bit general, but when Yahweh starts to speak, all of a sudden, when making reference to Yahweh, or Yahweh talking about himself, or in the text when the narrator will say, "And Yahweh said," it uses the term Yahweh. And I think this is possibly supposed to communicate the idea that up until this point, everything about Yahweh, the God of Israel, has been incorrect. Now the true Yahweh speaks. It's not El Shaddai. It's not Elohim. It's not these configurations that Job and his friends have put forward of who God is. It's truly God. It's truly God's mind being put forward. So now what we have to do is try to decipher what God's will is here. He comes from the whirlwind. It's referenced in chapter 38 and in chapter 40, where God speaks from a whirlwind. And, it's kind of hard to determine what this really means. The term whirlwind is used approximately 16 times in the Old Testament, but it seems to be that every time when the whirlwind is used as an expression of Yahweh, it's always an expression of Yahweh's wrath. So Yahweh somehow brings his judgment, like in the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, when he appears in the whirlwind to Ezekiel. It's to bring his wrath upon a certain group of people. So this seems to be what's happening here, is that Yahweh is actually really upset with Job. He's actually really upset with Job's friends, that they've said these things about God, that they have miscommunicated God's will. And it's not so much the simply the miscommunication of it, it's misunderstanding it and then saying that that's how it really is. Okay, this is something that all teachers of God's will, of God's word, really need to let soak in, is that we are responsible for our teachings. We cannot just simply say something and put it out there as cold hard fact when we don't have that truth. There are a lot of things that we don't have a full understanding of when it comes to God or His will or even Scripture. There are some things that we can say: the plan of salvation, why Jesus has come, how He has been promised through the Old Testament Scriptures, how He is the perfect sacrifice, how He is the perfect mediator. There are things like that we can say for sure. But there are a lot of other things that people will try to hold as fact when it's not spoken of so foundationally in Scripture as some people would try to say it is. So this is a big warning to us. Yahweh's really mad at Job. Yahweh is really mad at Job's friends because they've made a lot of accusations about God. They've made a lot of assumptions about God and His will and why He does things. And this could be the large reason why Yahweh is appearing in the whirlwind. So it's not simply to come and give wisdom, because that's what Yahweh's about to do. He's about to go in chapter 38 to this long monologue about wisdom. But that's not His sole purpose. It is actually to reprimand. It is to actually bring some exhortation. Yahweh's not coming just for pleasantries. He's coming to tell His will and to correct some false teaching. So it's no surprise that Job doesn't understand God's will. Okay, that's not something that we should be mad at Job for. Don't be mad at yourself. Don't be mad at another human for not understanding God's will perfectly. The problem is when we talk as if we do. When we talk like we know why God is doing something. Job does that several times in the earlier chapters, and so that's why Yahweh's coming at him the way He is. The entire book of Job has been Job really positing these questions to God. Sometimes in the form of accusations, but sometimes in just straight up questions. God, why are you allowing the righteous to suffer? Why are you doing things like this? How can you allow things like this to happen? He asks a lot of questions in the previous chapters. So what's really cool about this opening chapter with Yahweh talking is it's just a bunch of questions. It's kind of this idea that, okay, Job, you had your time. You got to ask all these questions. You got to reprimand me. You got to hurl these insults. You got to hurl these accusations. Now it's my turn. And the difference is Yahweh doesn't really hurl accusations. Everything is truth that comes out of Yahweh's mouth. But He does go into this long series of questions. Hey, where were you when I did this? Could you even do this if you wanted to? Those type of things. So Yahweh retorts with questions that demand answers. Job demanded answers. And now Yahweh, instead of giving answers right out, gives more questions. Which is interesting, because isn't that the way that Jesus often talked to people who are accusing Him or testing His teachings? He responds with questions. And it seems that Yahweh the Father does the same things. So there's an expected response. It's not that God is just yelling out these questions. There is an expected response, but the response is one that is meant to reflect a reassessment of Job's perspectives and beliefs. So don't look at these as purely rhetorical questions, because they are, but there is an expected response. So after Job hears question after question after question, it's not a verbal response, it is more a response of will and submission and humility, if that makes sense. So now looking at chapter 38 a little bit closer, just briefly kind of chopping it up a little bit so we can maybe read it through with a better structure in our minds. You kind of this introduction of Yahweh coming in the first couple of verses of 38. But then verses 4 through 38 are kind of this beautiful poetic, it's very nice Hebrew poetry here, but it's Yahweh expressing His control over the macrocosm. So over the whole universe, these big things that go on in the world, Yahweh was there. Yahweh set these things up. Yahweh is the one who not just created it and threw it out there, but he is the one who continues to sustain, who allows these things to exist. But I think it's worth kind of zooming in on verses 35 through 37, which is in response to Job's claims that the world operates according to this retributive principle, and because he has experienced injustice despite his living righteous. And that's why Job claims that God is unjust. So looking at verses 35 to 37 specifically, that is God addressing Job in that way. And note that he causes it to rain in places where people do not live. And you might be able to just read over that really quickly, not think anything about it. But what does that look? So rain is a positive thing. Rain is what brings growth, especially in this time when you relied on what you grew, what crops you were able to produce. Rain was a very good thing. So rain is a positive thing. So what does it mean if Yahweh is saying, I cause it to rain in places where there are no people? Well, he's throwing out the retributive principle. He's throwing out Job's friend's understanding of the world. God just doesn't do good things for good people. God just does good things. He blesses people with a will that we don't understand. It is actually not tied to what I do at all. If I am to receive blessings for things that I do, it's a part of God's grace. But if I do things and I'm not receiving immediate blessings from it, why do I have this expectation that I should? I think it's because a lot of times we live under this notion of a retributive principle, is that when I do something good, I should be rewarded. That's not how God operates. There is one maybe major retributive principle that overgirds all of existence, and that is when we believe in Jesus and have faith in him and live that out through obedience, we get to go to heaven. But again, that's not even because we did something good. That's because Jesus has done something good. So there is no retributive principle. So right there in this opening chapter of Yahweh speaking, he throws out this fundamental way of thinking that Job and his friends had. So verses 35 through 37 are something for you to really sit on and ponder. And the whole point of this cosmological argument is that Job isn't in control, that Yahweh's the one who did it all, nor could he be capable of controlling the cosmos. He's not God, he's a man. All these things that God set in motion, he couldn't simply hand over to Job. Job isn't capable. He's not in control. He's not able to bring the world into order the way that Yahweh did and bring justice that he thinks he deserves. He's just not capable. As a human, he cannot be made God. God has set these things the way that he has wanted them. Rather, he needs to understand. He has to understand Rather, he has underestimated the complexity of the system in front of him. More to the point, he can't even figure out Yahweh's methods, right? Everything up to this point, Job's gotten wrong. He can't understand Yahweh's methods. So how could he somehow manage a cohesive, coherent philosophy for the operation of the world as Yahweh has done? So 38 is powerful. It comes in and it hits hard. It's Yahweh saying, no one else could do this. You can't do this. You don't even understand what's happening. Everything you've said is wrong. So it's a really powerful chapter. It's really good. At the end of 38 in verse 39 through 40 in verse 2, you get some narrative, a change of persons talking. Job is going to speak for a couple of verses, and it's going to go back to Yahweh. But Yahweh does, in this next section, comment on a couple of animals, the lion, the raven, the ibex, the wild donkey, the wild ox, the ostrich, the horse, the hawk. And some scholars try to tie these things together. What I found, it's just really hard to figure out what's being said. As far as how these animals are tied in, why God uses these specific animals. But I think it's pretty much showing the traits of these different animals and how they relate to mankind. So in the first set of speeches, Job doesn't respond. What we find here in the opening verses of 40, he doesn't respond with words, so to say. He does respond in silence, and that is a response. Some people try to say that, oh, you're not saying anything. But silence is oftentimes a response. So if you're accused of something and you decide to remain quiet, doesn't that usually communicate something to somebody that maybe you actually did do it? So silence does communicate something. If God comes to Job and he's, railing him for thinking this way and denouncing everything that Job has said and saying, listen, you don't understand me, what can you say to something like that? There's no fight put up by Job. So it is almost like Job is now having this spirit of grace and humility. And then Yahweh starts speaking again in chapter 40 and verse 6. So the first challenge that Job had really put up in the first 27 chapters of the book of Job was this regard to someone who, let me rephrase that. Job puts forward this argument as towards the wisdom of the design. Job is accusing the design of the world. If this whole retributive principle isn't real or is real, it's messed up. So that's Job's pretty much his whole argument in the first 27 chapters. And so God has kind of addressed that in chapter 38. He says, you don't even understand my wisdom. You don't even understand what's happening here. How could you really comment on it? And so the second argument brought up in really chapters 29 through 37 is the idea of Yahweh's justice, that Yahweh isn't appropriately disciplining the wicked or punishing the wicked. A lot of the things that he says has to do with how God has unjustly punished the righteous person himself, and he's not doing a very good job of punishing those who are wicked. And so this section is going to comment on that, on kind of the second accusation put up by Job. As I've already mentioned before, Job was holding on to his own righteousness rather than assuming Yahweh was righteous in what he was doing. And that's the big thing that Yahweh points out here, is that you didn't trust in me. You didn't have faith in that what I was doing was righteous. You instead were certain that you were righteous and you didn't deserve punishment. And so Yahweh fights against that accusation pretty hard as well. In verses 15 of chapter 40 all the way through chapter 41 and verse 34, we have this big move from Yahweh reprimanding Job to more of like an instruction of Job. So Job is accused of treating Job accused Yahweh of treating him like a chaos creature, like night or terror. And that's a pretty big accusation, saying that the God of order is actually an agent of chaos, in that he brought chaos on Job. That's in chapter 7 and verse 12 and in chapter 30 as well. When in fact, chaos creatures are a part of God's created world. So that's an interesting thing to think about. And I want us to think about this as we get into this conversation of Behemoth and Leviathan. Is that agents of chaos seem to be a nice image that the author of Job wants to pull in here. There's a purpose behind it. And whenever Yahweh talks, it's about how Yahweh has ordered things. Even these crazy creatures like the Behemoth or Leviathan. So one of the things that's always brought up is we try to figure out what type of animal the Behemoth or the Leviathan is. And there's been plenty of studies done on this. A lot of different hypotheses put out, like hippopotamus or alligator or all these different types of things, but nothing quite adds up. So we try to say it's some prehistoric animal, but whatever the case, maybe we stop trying to figure out what the animal is, and we start trying to figure out what is its literary purpose in the book of Job. What is trying to be communicated by the Behemoth and the Leviathan? And I think John Walton in his commentary just put out this brilliant idea, and it's one I hadn't heard before, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So, ride with me here. The Behemoth is you and I, specifically Job in this context, and the Leviathan is God. Okay, hold on to that idea as we move towards it. So they're not zoological animals. They can't be. They're not going to be found in a science book, but are probably better termed as anti-chaos creatures. who kind of lie, and we're getting supernatural here in our conversation, okay? So move with me here in the spiritual thinking. These are creatures who lie kind of on the outside of creation, much like the Nahash in Genesis chapter 3. Now, we normally don't think of the Nahash when we talk about Genesis chapter 3, but we have to do something with the serpent that was in the garden. Now, a lot of people try to say it was the devil, but the book of Genesis has no concept of the devil, has no concept of Satan. So it doesn't make sense to try and push in an idea of Satan in Genesis chapter 3. Instead, it simply refers to it as the serpent, the Nahash. What is the Nahash? It is someone who kind of somehow plays outside the rules a little bit. Someone who is not necessarily trying to cause chaos, but is somewhat of a challenger. Maybe somewhat of a challenger like we see at the beginning of the book of Job. Someone who questions God, is part of God's counsel, kind of works on this edge of creation. Anyway, it's hard to draw a fine line as to what these are because they're not spoken of a lot in Scripture. But when we look at the comparison, when we take the behemoth to be ourselves and Job and Leviathan as God, I think literarily it starts to make a lot of sense. So rather than considering these to be creatures, we should consider not from where they came from, but their literary purpose. The behemoth as Job, the Leviathan as Yahweh. So the message of Job is that we should trust God's wisdom when we encounter suffering or crises, rather than trying to figure out our answers to the why question. Okay, so here's your assignment, is to read through the end of chapter 40 and into chapter 41, and every time it talks about the behemoth, think about you or I, or Job, and then the Leviathan, think of it as Yahweh. And if you've got some questions as to that, how that works, leave those in the comments. I could spell that out for you, but I think it's good work to kind of go through and read that for yourself. And in the last chapter of verse 42, we have this summation of everything that's happened. God all of a sudden, because Job has in a sense passed this test, he has wanted righteousness for righteousness' sake, not just to be rewarded with prosperity. Because Job has passed that test, God gives back to him everything that he took from him. And that might seem really callous. Have you ever thought about, if someone took my daughter from me, killed her, and then I passed some test, and they give me another daughter, I'm not really going to be over the death of the first daughter, am I? No. So why do we expect Job to be over the death of all those other children that he had? Does it seem kind of callous of God? He's taking away his livestock, taking away his way of life, almost, taking his health. He's taking all these things, and now he just gives them back to Job. Different kids, different land, different all these things. How is Job just supposed to let go of what's happened to him? I think this is a big picture we miss as well, is that God re-blessing Job, again, is not tied to Job. It has nothing to do with Job. It has all to do with God. Just because Job passes some test, is able to answer the challenger's questions and accusations, that didn't mean Job deserved to have everything back. God still blesses him because God is just a good God. Job learns that prosperity is not the reward he deserves. And it's not that God is obligated to provide. It's a gift. Job receiving everything back is not about Job, but about God. God gives not out of compulsion, but out of his goodness. He didn't owe Job these things. He willingly gave them. So this book is not about asking ourselves, what if we are Job, and what if we have to go through what he goes through, or not putting ourselves in Job's position. We're actually not supposed to handle the situation like Job. Job questions God's authority, questions God's wisdom, questions God's justice. And while he doesn't sin in those things, that doesn't mean we're supposed to repeat them. That's not what's being posited here. What we're supposed to take from it is a better understanding of God's will and what that looks like. What it looks like in this realm of suffering is sometimes God has a purpose for the things that happen. Sometimes there's a reason for the suffering that we endure. But we can in no way ever say what the will of God is. What we need to do is trust in God, who is full of wisdom, full of mercy, and full of justice. The book of Job is a book about trust. And that's hard to swallow because it doesn't answer a lot of questions that we want answered. But that's again where we give it up to God. God's the only answer that we really need. So I hope this has been a beneficial study. Next week we'll be moving on to the book of Proverbs and more wisdom literature. Thanks, and hope to study with you again next week. Peace and love.